On New Year's morning, one name quietly emerged from a tragedy that had already shocked an entire country. Not a celebrity, not a public figure. Just a 17-year-old athlete whose future was only beginning. Emanuele Galeppini was not supposed to be the headline, but his name became the first officially confirmed victim of a fire that would leave dozens dead and more than 100 injured. And what makes this story unsettling isn't just what happened that night. It's how quickly a moment of celebration turned into something no one expected. To understand why this mattered so deeply, we need to go back to who Emanuele was and what was happening inside that ski resort when the new year began. Emanuele Galeppini was 17 years old. He was Italian. And according to the Italian Golf Federation, he was a young athlete known not only for talent, but for discipline, commitment, and character. In a public statement shared by the Federation, they described him as someone who carried passion and authentic values, the kind of language organizations use sparingly and only when it feels deserved. Emanuele was part of a new generation of golfers working toward professional careers, still in development, still learning, still planning years ahead, which is why his name being the first confirmed victim of the Crans-Montana fire immediately changed how the tragedy was perceived. This wasn't just a large-scale incident, it was personal. And while many details were still unclear, one thing was already evident. This event would leave a long-lasting impact far beyond Switzerland. But how did a holiday celebration in one of Europe's most well-known ski resorts turn into a national emergency? Within minutes. According to publicly available information from Swiss authorities and international news outlets, the incident occurred during New Year's celebrations at a bar in the Crans-Montana ski resort. It was late. People were welcoming the new year. The environment was described as festive and crowded, something common for that location and time. Officials later stated that a fire began inside the venue and spread rapidly. Emergency services were called immediately, and a large-scale response followed. At least 40 people lost their lives. More than 100 others were injured. Authorities emphasized early on that the situation was complex and that confirming identities would take time. Accuracy, they said, was critical, especially for the families waiting for answers. This is why Emanuele Galeppini's identification carried such weight. It marked the moment the tragedy became real for the public. But identifying victims was only one part of a much larger challenge authorities were facing. During a press conference, Swiss judicial officials explained that identifying the deceased was their absolute priority. They made it clear that no assumptions would be rushed, no shortcuts taken. Families, they said, deserved certainty and respect. At the time, several victims remained unidentified, and officials confirmed that the process would take days, possibly longer. Meanwhile, national leaders acknowledged the scale of the tragedy. Switzerland's president described the event as a moment of joy that had suddenly turned into a nationwide shock. Messages of condolence began arriving from across Europe. For many, the question became unavoidable. How could something like this happen in such a controlled, well-regulated environment? And as investigators began reviewing footage and witness accounts, a possible explanation started to emerge, one that raised new questions rather than clear answers. According to statements from the regional attorney general, investigators believe the fire may have started due to celebratory items being placed too close to the ceiling. This assessment was reportedly based on video analysis and interviews with people who were present. Officials were careful with their wording. They emphasized that the incident was being treated as an accident, not a criminal act. No arrests were made. No suspects were named. Fire service representatives echoed this position, stating that there was no indication of intentional wrongdoing. Still, the speed at which the situation escalated left many questioning safety practices in crowded holiday venues. And while investigators focused on causes, survivors were beginning to speak, not in search of attention, but to explain just how fast everything changed. Several survivors later shared their experiences with international media. Their accounts were not detailed descriptions, but reflections on confusion, fear, and urgency. One teenager told reporters that the situation shifted from celebration to chaos in moments, leaving people disoriented and trying to understand what was happening around them. Another survivor described the exits becoming difficult to navigate as people tried to leave at the same time. Authorities and journalists have been careful when reporting these accounts, avoiding graphic details and focusing instead on the broader reality. This was an unexpected emergency in a confined space. Emergency responders later praised many individuals for helping others escape despite the confusion. But as the immediate crisis passed, a deeper question remained. How would this tragedy be remembered? As the immediate emergency response began to stabilize, the impact of what happened in Crans, Montana started spreading far beyond the ski resort itself. News outlets across Europe carried the same restrained headline structure. A New Year's celebration suddenly interrupted. A high number of casualties, an investigation still unfolding. But for Italy's sporting community, one detail stood out above all others. Emanuele Galeppini was not just a name on a list. He was a developing athlete with an active competitive path. The Italian Golf Federation's statement was brief, but deliberate. No speculation, no dramatic language, just acknowledgement of loss and respect for his family. That tone was mirrored by other sports organizations, which avoided commentary on the event itself and instead focused on remembrance. In moments like this, restraint matters, and many institutions were careful to model it. Yet while official reactions stayed measured, public attention continued to grow, especially as new numbers were confirmed. In the days following the fire, Swiss authorities held additional press briefings to clarify what was known. They confirmed that at least 40 people had lost their lives, more than 100 were injured, and dozens of families across multiple countries were affected. Officials also released information about the nationalities of those involved, highlighting how international the gathering had been. Visitors from Switzerland, France, Italy, and several other European nations were present, a reminder that holiday destinations often bring together people who would otherwise never cross paths. This detail changed how the story was understood. It wasn't a local issue. It was a shared European tragedy, and with that realization came increased scrutiny, not in the form of accusations but in questions about prevention. Because when something happens at this scale, the conversation inevitably shifts from what happened to what can be learned. Authorities were careful to state that investigations were ongoing and that conclusions should not be rushed. Still, experts and commentators began discussing broader themes, not tied to blame but to awareness. Crowded indoor spaces, celebratory environments, temporary decorations or effects used during holidays. None of these are unusual on their own. But together they require careful management. Swiss officials emphasized that existing safety protocols were being reviewed, not because they had failed by definition, but because continuous improvement is part of public responsibility. This approach mattered. It signaled that the goal was understanding, not sensationalism. And while officials worked behind the scenes, families were facing something far more difficult: waiting. One of the most challenging aspects, according to authorities, was the identification process. Officials repeatedly explained why it could not be rushed. Mistakes, they said, were not acceptable. Families deserved certainty. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Several victims remained unidentified for days, prolonging uncertainty for loved ones across borders. This quiet phase of the tragedy rarely dominates headlines, but it defines how events like this are remembered by those most affected. For Emanuele Galeppini's family, confirmation brought grief, but also clarity. And clarity in moments like these becomes a form of closure. But even as families began to receive answers, the broader public kept asking one question: how do you process something that happened so quickly and changed so much? Part of the reason this event resonated was timing. New Year's celebrations are universally associated with hope, renewal, and forward-looking expectations. When a moment defined by optimism is interrupted, the emotional contrast is powerful, even when reported responsibly. Another reason was relatability. The people involved were not distant figures. They were teenagers, families, tourists, athletes, individuals at a familiar stage of life. Emanuele Galeppini especially became a symbol not because of how he died, but because of who he was becoming. A future that will never fully unfold. And that brings us to the most important part of this story, not the incident itself, but what remains after the headlines fade. As media coverage gradually slowed, the reality of the Crans, Montana fire didn't disappear. It simply moved out of the spotlight. For investigators, work continued quietly. For families, life began dividing into before and after. And for the public, the story became one of reflection rather than updates. Tragedies like this often feel distant once the news cycle moves on. But their effects remain, especially in communities connected through shared experiences. In Italy's golfing circles, Emanuele Galeppini's name began appearing not in breaking news, but in moments of silence, acknowledgments, and remembrance. These gestures mattered. They reframed the story from an event to a life. But remembrance alone doesn't answer the question many people quietly ask: how do societies respond after something like this? According to public statements, Swiss authorities began reviewing safety practices related to indoor celebrations, not as a reaction driven by pressure, but as a standard process following any major incident. These reviews are rarely dramatic. They don't come with immediate announcements or visible reforms. Instead, they happen through updated guidelines, internal evaluations, and conversations that never make headlines. This is often how real change begins, not with outrage, but with careful reassessment. And while no single adjustment can undo what happened, these quiet steps shape how future events are planned and managed. Still, for many viewers, the question remains deeply personal. Why did this particular story feel so heavy? Numbers help explain scale, but they rarely explain impact. 40 lives lost, over 100 injured. Those figures matter, but they don't capture individual stories. Emanuele Galeppini's story stood out not because it was more important than others, but because it was identifiable. A young athlete, a clear path forward, a name that represented potential. In moments like this, people don't connect to statistics, they connect to individuals, and that connection is what turns news into memory. Which leads to a broader realization, one that goes beyond this single event. Stories like the Crans-Montana fire are revisited not to reopen woes, but to preserve understanding. They remind us that safety is not abstract, that planning matters, that ordinary moments can carry unexpected risks. And they remind us of something else, something quieter, but just as important. Every headline involves people whose lives extended far beyond that moment. Emanuele Galeppini will be remembered in Italian sport not for how his life ended, but for the promise it held. That distinction matters. In the end, this story isn't about fear. It's about awareness. It's about how communities respond when celebration turns into reflection, and how institutions, families, and individuals move forward with care. The investigation into the Crans-Montana fire continues, and final conclusions will take time. That patience is intentional, because understanding requires accuracy, not speed. In our next video, we'll take a closer look at how large-scale public events across Europe adapt safety measures after major incidents, and what quietly changes long after the cameras leave. If you want to understand not just what happened, but what happens next, that's where the story continues.